My name is Claire Hudson, and on the day of my wedding, my own brother struck me in the face. It wasn't an accident, nor the careless swing of someone drunk. It was a deliberate blow, a clenched fist that slammed into my cheek with a sound burned into my memory. One moment, I was holding my vows. The next, I staggered backward, my head reeling as my veil slid from my shoulder. The entire garden froze. Somewhere behind me, a champagne glass shattered on the stone walkway, its sharp echo piercing the stunned silence. Every guest stared, eyes flicking between me and Ryan, as though waiting for permission to believe what they had just seen. The music played on for a beat too long before cutting out, the last notes mocking the horror they accompanied. Heat spread across my face, blood pooled in my mouth, and my veil tangled around the heel of my shoe, nearly pulling me down onto the dress my mother had chosen before she died. My grandmother's gasp rang louder than anything else. In that absurd moment, I thought only of my lipstick smudging. Ryan stood steady, his gaze fixed on me, cold, fierce, and disturbingly satisfied, as though he had made a point to the entire crowd. My husband, Jack Monroe, rushed to my side, but all I could register was the oppressive silence pressing in from 70 unmoving witnesses. That is the thing about violence. The impact is quick, but the stillness afterward consumes you. I was the bride in white silk and lace, with blood on my lips and swelling on my cheek, and not one person knew how to respond. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, humiliated and trembling, my heart racing as though it wanted out of my chest. Faces blur before me, staring, whispering, but no one stepped forward. The shame cut deeper than the pain. And with it came the realization Ryan hadn't just ruined my wedding. He had betrayed me in front of every person who mattered to us. Why? Why would my brother raise his hand against me on the one day I was meant to feel safe? That question filled the silence louder than the blow itself, demanding an answer I didn't yet have. Growing up in a military household, discipline and appearances were everything. My father wore his uniform like part of his body, and my mother polished our home until it gleamed, as if neatness could cover the fatigue on her face. Ryan thrived in that structure. He was loud, bold, and exactly the son they wanted. I, on the other hand, was quiet, the daughter who slipped into the background. When Ryan scored a goal or impressed a teacher, my parents cheered and spoke of his bright future. When I earned good grades, they simply nodded and told me to keep at it. That small difference grew into something heavier over the years until I learned not to expect more. At home, Ryan's confidence turned sharp. He'd take my things without asking, rip the covers off my bed, or shove me around to remind me who held power. If I cried, he laughed. If I stayed silent, he mocked me for being weak. My parents dismissed it as ordinary sibling rivalry, telling me to toughen up, as though ignoring cruelty could somehow make me stronger. So I adapted. I stopped complaining, stopped seeking help, stopped expecting fairness. I shrank myself, hoping to keep the peace, even when it didn't work. I told myself silence was safer than fighting a battle no one acknowledged. That habit followed me long into adulthood. As time went on, the gap between us became a chasm. I built my life on education and persistence, finding success without needing applause. Ryan clung to his military stories and medals, to authority that demanded recognition. At family gatherings, he commanded attention with tales of missions and danger. When people asked about my work, he cut in with jokes that made me seem insignificant. My achievement he called technical or boring. After one fundraiser presentation, he mocked me in front of others, saying, "Didn't know PowerPoint counted as service." Everyone laughed. I smiled too, though inside I felt the old weight of being belittled. I never wanted rivalry. I only wanted to exist without being compared. But Ryan couldn't allow that. Every time I spoke with confidence, I saw his jaw tighten, as though my voice stole something from him. He remembered my mistakes, repeating them to others as reminders of where I belonged. It wasn't about me failing him. It was about him refusing to see me as anything but a rival. What began as childhood rivalry had soured into something toxic, where my strength became a threat he could never forgive. And then there was Jack. I met him during a joint training exercise in a place that felt more like punishment than preparation. The air was scorching, the ground cracked, and tempers snapped easily. Most people fill the heat with noise, desperate to prove themselves through volume. Jack was different. He was steady, quiet in a way that drew respect without effort. The first time I really noticed him, I was bent over a map at a dust-covered table, brushing sand from the lines while chaos erupted around me. Their voices crashed against each other, every man straining to outdo the rest with louder tones and heavier words. Jack lingered at the edge, quiet, simply watching. Then he moved forward and said, almost gently, "You're the only one actually looking at the map." No smile, no explanation, just a statement that made me lift my head. And in that instant, I felt noticed in a way that mattered. That was who Jack was. He never fought for space, yet the space around him shifted naturally to make room. Where others pushed, bragged, or tried to intimidate, he stayed calm, and it unsettled them. He didn't bark to command attention. He didn't need to. When he finally chose to speak, people listened. It wasn't power he carried, it was presence. That quiet gravity weighed more than any outburst ever could. One night after a long day in the field, people clustered around a fire, sipping weak coffee and trading hollow stories. Jack sat apart, steady with his dented cup in hand. I walked over and offered half a protein bar I had forgotten in my pocket. He accepted it without ceremony, as though I'd handed him something meaningful. After a pause, he asked, "What you miss most about peace?" Not home, not comfort, peace. The question startled me. I thought for a while before answering, not having to look over my shoulder. He nodded once. That's a good one. He didn't pad the silence with chatter. He let it stretch, and somehow the moment was enough. From then on, I watched him differently. The way he read a room before speaking. The way he never cut people down. The way his restraint wasn't weakness, but a kind of control that steadied everyone near him. With Jack, I didn't have to defend every word. I could simply exist. That safety, quiet but undeniable, was something I had never truly known. Jack was everything Ryan wasn't. Where Ryan demanded dominance, Jack offered balance. Where Ryan shrank others to feel larger, Jack gave them space to breathe. It wasn't performance, it was his nature. In his presence, I learned my voice mattered. Not because it was loud, but because it was mine. That was the first time I understood what it meant to be protected without condition. The garden that day looked like a dream. White lanterns swung gently from the branches, chairs curved neatly toward an arch of magnolias, and the stone path gleamed under soft afternoon light. My dress trailed behind me, every step carrying me closer to a promise I had longed for all my life. Guests smiled, whispered, snapped photos, while the music drifted lightly in the background. My nerves sparked with joy. Nervous but bright, the feeling of standing at the start of something whole. Jack waited at the altar, steady, grounding me with nothing more than his presence. For a moment, everything was complete. Then Ryan arrived. 15 minutes late. His uniform crisp, his face flushed, the sour edge of alcohol clinging to him. The mood shifted instantly, though no one said a word. He moved down the aisle as if it were his own, pulling the attention away from me, away from the vows about to be spoken. Unease rippled through the crowd. In my chest, a knot formed, warning that the peace was already breaking. I had just begun my vows when Ryan pushed up from the second row, moving sharp and deliberate, his jaw locked like he was marching into battle. Before I could react, his fist slammed into my cheek. Pain exploded, forcing me back 2 steps, nearly tangling me in my gown. The sound of the strike rang louder than the music, louder than the gasps, louder than the glass shattering in someone's hand. The garden froze. 70 people, rooted in silence, breathless and wide-eyed. Blood filled my mouth, heat spread beneath my skin, but worse than pain was the shame, the humiliation of being struck down in white silk and lace before everyone who came for love. Jack moved before I could steady myself. He stepped between us, his calm more dangerous than any shout. His gaze locked on Ryan, cold and cutting, and when he spoke, the words landed like iron. Face the wall. You assaulted an officer. No one moved. Not even Ryan. His expression flickered from shock to panic as the weight of Jack's command sank in. In that moment, Jack stripped him of authority more completely than any blow could. Ryan stood exposed, humiliated, the shield of respect he had carried his whole life gone in an instant. The ceremony didn't end when Ryan was led away. It ended in the suffocating silence that followed. My cheek throbbed, my dress was torn, and 70 pairs of eyes pressed against me. Some stared, others dropped their gaze, a few whispered as if searching for an explanation. I expected anger, but it didn't come. What I felt instead was clarity, sharp and undeniable. Ryan had finally revealed to everyone what I had carried alone for years. Now, no one could pretend anymore. Jack never left me. He didn't flood me with questions or try to paint me as strong. He just stayed near, steady as ever, his hand brushing mine until I let him hold it. That touch anchored me more than any speech could. Around us, guests faltered, my aunt covering her mouth, a child crying in the back, but all I felt was the quiet relief of truth stepping out from its hiding place. One of the men who had served with my father coughed and turned away, as if pretending not to see could erase what had just happened. A few guests made tentative steps forward, but each stopped short when they realized no one else would move. Whatever unity the crowd had shared dissolved into hesitation and fear of taking sides. I could have walked out. I could have demanded the ceremony be called off. Instead, I turned toward Jack. My voice trembled when I whispered, "Do you still want to?" He nodded without pause, and under the crooked arch we exchanged vows. They weren't elegant or rehearsed, but they were real. At the reception afterward, the air felt fractured. Some guests hovered on the edges, apologizing for things that weren't theirs to own. Others slipped out early, unwilling to linger in a space now haunted by violence. Plates of food remained untouched. The music felt hollow. Yet through it all, Jack stayed close. He didn't try to erase what had happened or pretend things were normal. He simply stayed. I sat with a cold compress pressed against my cheek. Jack poured 2 glasses of water, handed me one, and sat beside me in silence. Our shoulders touched as we breathed together in sync. My body ached, but in that stillness I realized something new. For the first time, I wasn't alone in the aftermath. Healing had already begun. It doesn't stand still. It grows. It shields the wrong people. For months, I lived under the shadow of that wedding day, carrying a bruise that vanished from my skin but never from memory. They were colleagues, subordinates, women who had served under Ryan's command. Their stories were different, but the pattern was painfully familiar. Charm in public, control in private. He chipped away at their confidence, threatened careers, left them doubting their own worth. They had stayed quiet because they believed no one would believe them. When I sat across from one of them and listened as she shook her way through her story, I saw my younger self reflected in her. I opened a drawer, slid across copies of the incident report from my wedding, and told her, "You're not alone." I watched her shoulders fall in relief. In that moment, I knew the silence had cracked. Word spread. One by one, voices joined. The weight of testimony grew too heavy to dismiss. The military postponed Ryan's promotion, then placed him under review. The man who had once commanded rooms with sheer presence now stood at the edge of ruin. His power had been built on silence, and silence was gone. What I felt wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was truth, finally breathing through the fractures he had created. I understood then, men like him survive on silence, and the only way they fall is when silence is broken. The cost had been heavy, but the story was no longer his to control. When Jack and I left the military, it wasn't defeat. It was release, stepping out of armor we had worn for too long. We moved to a small town where mornings unfolded slowly, pines scented the air, and nights carried nothing but crickets and our own breathing. Our house was plain, with a wide porch that caught the evening sun. Jack built a shed out back, where he worked with his hands. I found my place at a local center, supporting veterans and their families. I wasn't a therapist, but I knew how to listen. I knew the silence of those carrying too much, and I could sit with them without rushing their pain away. Every story reminded me, healing isn't erasing the past. It's learning to live with it without fear. 2 years later, I returned to the garden where my wedding had shattered. The magnolia tree still bloomed heavy, the stone path curved the same way. But the chairs were gone, the crowd was gone. Only Jack stood with me this time. I wore a simple dress, no makeup. We spoke our vows quietly, not for approval, not for witnesses, but for ourselves. Walking along the fence at the back, I placed my hand on the rough wood and felt no fear. The ghosts of that day no longer held me. I looked at Jack, steady as ever, and felt peace settle deep inside. I smiled, breathed, and whispered the words I had waited years to speak. This time I am